Holy cow, it's time for another Sacred Cow Barbecue. Grab a plate if you're hungry for some truth. We're here to free our minds from our collective BS, our belief systems programmed into us through a lifetime of indoctrination by school, church, and media. No subjects off limits. Why? Because it's all connected. Stay tuned. Good evening and welcome to Sacred Cow Barbecue. I'm Patricia Aiken, an average host with exceptional guests. Later on, we'll be unwinding some of the Oregon Refuge trial news, and I'll be rescinding what I said, or some of what I said about Ryan Payne last week. But right now, I have the privilege of welcoming Dr. James Beck, who has been instrumental in stopping fluoridation in Calgary and other Canadian cities. He graduated from Washington University School of Medicine, went on to Berkeley, that crazy place where he received his PhD in biophysics. His curriculum vitae goes on and on. Why we have him here tonight is because he co-authored The Case Against Fluoride with Paul Conant, another renowned PhD in the fight against fluoride. So Jim Beck, thank you so much for making time to be on the barbecue tonight.
You're welcome.
Well, tell us, how did an academic researcher and lecturer get so involved in fighting City Hall on fluoride?
Well, my attention to fluoridation was aroused when a committee here in Calgary, composed of 5 dentists who oppose fluoridation and a general practitioner of medicine, they asked me to join them in their effort. And I had just ignored fluoridation before that, and then so I took a look at it. And the first thing was I was appalled by the ethical issue about using an unapproved medication without the consent of the people you're giving it to and not following up on its effects. So then I undertook to understand the questions of whether it's safe for humans and whether it's effective for preventing cavities. And as I got the information and studied the scientific literature on both the questions of safety and efficacy, I had grave doubts. I've come to the conclusion that it's not substantially effective. What little effect it has is admitted even by promoters of fluoridation, such as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, admit that its effect is topical. And drinking it from your tap water doesn't give you enough concentration in saliva to have any effect. But dental applications of very, very high concentrations of fluoride do give some positive effect in preventing cavities. Also, I came to the conclusion on safety that in general we just don't know. But over the past, 18 years that I've been following this issue, we've come across more and more evidence that fluoridation is associated with various adverse effects. And
what kind of adverse effects?
Well, the ones we're more sure of is it depresses the activity of the thyroid system. As a matter of fact, in the 1940s and 50s, physicians were using sodium fluoride given to patients orally to control hyperthyroidism. So it was given deliberately to depress the activity of the thyroid system. That's one. Another, of course, is dental fluorosis, which is very common, and over 30% of the children in the United States have dental fluorosis. It's an effect on the enamel of the teeth that causes discoloration, and when it's very severe, it causes structural problems with the teeth. And then there are evidence now of effect related to a very common disease. Over 10%, I'm told, of children in the United States show signs of ADHD, a disease, of behavioral sort of disease. And similarly, there are problems with fractures in elderly people that seem to be associated with oral exposure to fluoride. And it just goes on, really.
Yeah, I know there's a city, it's like on the state line. One side of the state line, I think it's Kentucky, has fluoridation and has for a long time. And the other side, the other state that's bordering that doesn't. And I'm not going to say that I'm a geography expert to tell you that one without looking at the map. But in one side, the fractures amongst the elderly in the fluoridated part is off the wazoo and insignificant in the other.
Yeah. Well, we have some good comparisons on a fairly large scale here in Canada about the prevalence of cavities, of dental caries, and its association with fluoridation. Like, for example, the province of British Columbia, just west of my province of Alberta, has no fluoridation except for 2 or 3 very small towns and cities. Their prevalence of cavities in children is much lower than that of Ontario, for example, in the eastern part of Canada, where fluoridation has been going on for a long time. And similarly, the comparison between Ontario with a high incidence of cavities and the nearby province of Quebec is similar, because Quebec, now they have only about 3% of their population fluoridated. Their oral health with respect to cavities is much better than that of Ontario. And so the story goes.
Well, okay. So who's behind this? You know, I know in your book that you wrote with Paul Conant that you talked about that they weren't even done with the studies when they were already recommending fluoridation. Who was behind that? Those things don't just happen.
Well, I generally try to stay away from discussing the motivations and so on, because I think people, especially politicians, stop listening if they think you're accusatory and so on. But in the early days, when the idea was just being generated in the 1930s and early 40s, there were problems, industrial problems of exposure to surrounding areas and effects on human beings and cattle in those areas that led to suspicion about exposure to fluoridation. And then the interest in that spread, and the result was that the companies that were involved in processes, profit-making processes, that involved the use of fluoride and were associated with exposure of surrounding areas to their production facilities, organized, they got a committee of lawyers and whose job was to protect them against court cases, which were beginning to succeed. This story, I mean, actually, it's a very ugly story, and it's something I think we should face up to. It's like this recent revelation of the professor at Harvard, selling his soul to suppress the blame of sugar for cavities in children's teeth, knowing that sugar was a major factor. That kind of thing happens. Fortunately, it's not common, but the discussion of this kind of process in the case of fluoridation is very nicely discussed in a book by Christopher Bryson called The Fluoride Deception. And it's not a long book, and much of it is the notes that document what he says, because what he says is shocking. And so that if any of your listeners are interested in that, the title is The Fluoride Deception, and the author is Christopher Bryson. You can also get some.
I've seen that book, and I think I've glanced through it. It is pretty shocking. So, I mean, you're an academic researcher, PhD, heavily into it. How did your colleagues react when you started getting involved and going before the city council?
Well, I didn't get involved until I was here in Calgary, and I was on the staff of the medical school at the University of Calgary, and they never said anything about it because it didn't really affect my role as a researcher and teacher in the Faculty of Medicine. I did do some speaking, which included hospitals and so on, but actually I didn't receive any direct interference with what I did. It was all on my own time and at my own expense. So that was not a problem, but it has been a problem for other people.
Yeah. Well, I'm surprised you got out unscathed on that. And so what was your reaction? How did the city councils respond to you when you started going and testifying in these things?
Well, it must have been in about the year 2000 or something. I went to the counselor who was counselor for my ward, whom I had heard had doubts about fluoridation, and Calgary wasn't fluoridated. Hadn't been fluoridated for very long, but anyway, he encouraged me to talk to counselors and inform them on what the correct story was. Because the only story most politicians and most of the public gets are from supporters of fluoridation, and that's okay. They have a case to argue, but their arguments aren't substantial. Because I've debated before councils with supporters of fluoridation, not in public meetings because they won't meet with opponents of fluoridation in the public. Back in the early days, way back, they were instructed by one of their principal leaders in the United States, a dentist, who said, "Don't agree to public appearances with opponents of fluoridation because it just gives them credibility." What he's really worried about is he didn't have any evidence to show that it was safe or any evidence to show it was effective. So he didn't want to be exposed. But that's a sad tale, because what does that mean his relationship to his responsibility to public health was? That's, well, I don't want to get onto that. It's infuriating.
It is. It's infuriating. I saw the movie Bakst, from cover up to conspiracy, for 3 times in 4 days.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So the CDC covered that up for 4 years, and they had to know long before then too. So they were ruining people's careers like Andrew Wakefield. So this isn't anything new.
No. But you asked me a question about what I found when I started studying this, and when I started talking to counselors. Well, so then after I talked to my counselor, I went ahead trying to make appointments with other counselors, both singly and in groups, and this went on for years. I say for a decade, and more and more of them became convinced. And we were also faced with the matter of plebiscites, because Calgary had 6 plebiscites.
Okay, and plebiscite is a word that we don't use in the U.S. Would you explain that for our U.S. listeners?
Okay, a referendum.
Referendum, that's the word we use.
Yeah, that's a public vote on an issue. And the first four of those, the public by a narrow margin rejected fluoridation. And in the last two, I think, it was by a very narrow margin, they approved of the idea of fluoridation. Now, that's a strange thing, you know. If you get sick or you're concerned about getting some disease and want to prevent it, do you gather your neighbors together and have them take a vote on whether you should take a medicine? That's an absurd idea. Well, it's also an absurd idea that the city council should make that kind of decision for you. But you can argue that the city council at least has the resources to inform itself. Not that many of them do, but
take the time.
But that's not the way. That's not the way to practice medicine or public health.
Well, that's one of the key issues about fluoride. I mean, you're dosing everyone, regardless of their particular medical condition, with their size, how much they drink. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely absurd way to practice. Even if fluoride was good for you, it would be an absurd way to give it to people.
Well, as I've debated with medical and dental officers of health here in Canada. The health matter of maintaining health is a provincial responsibility, and provinces have like in Alberta here, we have the Alberta Health Services, and they have as part of their staff physicians trained in public health and dentists sometimes trained in public health and so on, and they have nothing to give us as evidence of safety or evidence of efficacy.
It's just a religion.
Yeah, well, and they even say that we who have come to the conclusion that it's wrong to do have no evidence. That they say there is no evidence of association of fluoridation with adverse conditions. There are thousands of papers on that very thing. And some of those bits of evidence are very strong. And they not only seem to ignore that, but they tell us and the public that there's no such evidence. That's public health scale malpractice. So, but it's very difficult to argue because, you see, take the medical officer of health in Calgary and walk into the council meeting, and he's the authority. He's working for the province as a person whose principal responsibility is protecting the health of 4 million people. He can't be wrong. See? So, but he is wrong. But, okay, so alongside him, say, I walked in, just the kid off the street, right? And I say, he's wrong. And here's the evidence for my concluding that he's wrong. And the counselors, they don't know what a randomized controlled study is, a trial, and they don't know what had the pH relationship to hydrofluoric acid after you drink the water and in your stomach and so on. And that's not their fault, but they say, well, I can't understand this, so I better go with the authority.
Well, so that must have really tipped the scales when you walked in. Well,
I'm not taking credit for what happened.
Well, you don't have to. I know you're not trying to pat yourself on the back, but I know when I've been involved in these fights and we get a professional, someone with, especially a researcher. I'll take a researcher over an MD any day of the week because they'll actually look at the facts. And so that really had to, the anti-fluoride people must have been jumping up and down when you walked in.
Well, well, they don't seem to like me.
Really?
But but and I don't want to be disliked, but this is important. People are getting hurt, and unfairly, and so we have to correct that, and that means arguing with the authorities that are recognized as protecting health, and they. It's very difficult. I sympathize with town and city councils. The law requires that they make a decision that they have no business making, and you get arguments even from these physicians who are medical authors of health. Oh, the fluoride in the water is not a drug. Well, it's I can give you the definition from the Ontario. I mean the Stedman's Medical Dictionary, from any English language dictionary. A substance that is not natural is given for the purpose of preventing or treating a disease. It's by definition a drug. And in 1957, the Supreme Court of Canada agreed with that. They say, yes, it's a drug. And it has no business in the water because the treatment of the water has to do with the potability, not with medical treatment.
Exactly. You just don't want you want it to be clean. I mean, Canada has some of the best water I've ever had. I mean, in British Columbia, up in Whistler, best water I've ever had.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's you want the water to be clean, and you don't want it to be contaminated. In the case of fluoride, you see, most of the fluoridation in North America is done with hydrofluorosilicic acid. And that's a compound that is a result of scrubbers, and mostly in the phosphate fertilizer production. It produces hydrofluorosilicic acid, which when added with water will dissociate mostly, and most of the fluoride is released as fluoride ion, and that's what it's in the water you drink. But it's not only considered this is used to be an industrial waste, but since they began to sell it, it became a byproduct instead of a waste.
Yeah, I know, it's just crazy. And I've seen the container. It's like the big ice cream, gallons, or multiple gallons that ice cream parlors use. But it has a skull and crossbones on it.
You have what now?
There's a skull and crossbones on the fluoride containers.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's good.
Yeah, I know. So you think that's good? Someone here is curious about what kind of water you drink.
Yeah. Well, when fluoride was put in our water, along with the arsenic and the lead and the mercury and the radioactive substances that came with it, I and my family drank water that had been processed by reverse osmosis. Now, that cost me about $600 a year. And the Canadian dollar was very close to the value of the U.S. dollar at that time, and that didn't hurt me. I could afford that. And I'm grateful that I could afford that. But a lot of people couldn't. Mm-hmm. And so they were, whether they wanted it or not, whether they even knew about it or not, they were swallowing this substance, was as chock full of toxic products. For example, the goal for any water used domestically for arsenic, for example, is 0.
Yeah, right.
But you can't, since that's impossible to reach for most uses, the regulatory authorities say, well, we won't disallow it, but it has to be below a certain level. See, but it's still a poison if it's below that level, right?
Right, and it's still cumulative. That's the problem with things that are metals, especially, that they accumulate in the body. That's why I drink distilled water, because it takes the metals out. it acts as a chelator in the body.
Oh, one of your questions also about how this got started. Well, I guess I should answer that unless you want.
No, go right ahead.
In the 1940s in the United States, there was organized an effort to do tests. So there were 4 studies planned, 2 in the United States, 1 in Canada, and 1 in New Zealand. Now, they were supposed to start in 1945 and end in 1955. Well, the studies in New Zealand, they were delayed, but when they were started, it was discovered that they were fraudulent, that they used false data to show that fluoride was good for us. In the case of the Canadian cities, the cities were very badly matched, and it showed no difference in the city that was fluoridated and the city who wasn't fluoridated. But in the case of the United States, similar. There was no evidence for its safety or for its effectiveness. Although they didn't study it for its safety. That's another thing, that to get a drug into use legally and responsibly, it has to be first tested for safety. That's usually done, on animals, of course, but then it goes to a test on a small group of humans who know that it's being tested on them and they're paid and so on. And if they don't fall dead, then they go on to larger studies. And the ones that study for efficacy to see if it's effective and does what it's supposed to do, will be done in a very rigid way and by what's called a randomized controlled trial. And it's designed to prevent to modify the effects of what are called confounding variables. That means things like in testing fluoride, things other than the concentration of fluoride that might affect it. You have to fix it so it doesn't. Those other effects don't mess up your judgment on the judgment you're interested in, which is the fluoride. So,
in October. Doctor, I'm sorry to interrupt here. In October of 2010, I believe it was, the Atlantic Monthly published an article saying how the placebo effect in these double-blind studies was so difficult for the drug companies to overcome that their placebos were testing better than their actual drugs.
Yeah, well, that's not uncommon, I must say, but I wanted to say, just as a final point, is that there has never been a randomized controlled trial of fluoride as a preventive of dental caries, of cavities. Never, not one.
No, well, there's never been a safety study on vaccines, not one. Well, they start to do them, and then they end them because too many kids die. So
that's a question I don't know much about, and I get accused of being against everything because I'm against fluoride. That's one of the things that a lot of the promoters do. They say, "Oh, Beck's against fluoridation. He thinks it's put in the water by aliens who are trying to take over the world," and so on, and he's against vaccinations and all of that. That's very confusing.
Well, that's just the type of argument that they would use to throw people off, and ridiculous. So listen, what some of the listeners want to know, you have an edge here with your background to go into a city council, but what a credentialed people do? How do people that aren't scientists? Is there some kind of foolproof recipe that you can let activists in on how to get this taken out of their towns and cities?
Well, the procedures for different jurisdictions, different councils, and different cities are different. And so what you have to do is learn what the procedures are. And if it's at all possible to find a counselor, even if it's just one, who is, if not opposed to fluoridation, open to consideration.
Right.
And then you start talking to her or him and showing her or him the evidence and explaining it to her or him if they're not a scientist or someone who's familiar with the way things must be done. And then if that interest of that counselor grows, they can get you access to other counselors. And it's a slow process, but you mustn't forget that just because it's slow doesn't make it okay. There's still people being hurt, and cities that can't afford it spending a lot of medicine on something that's not effective.
Well,
a lot of money on something that's not effective. So but you start with the counselors. You're quiet and rational and polite, but emphatic. And you say, this is what I've learned, and this is how I've learned it, and I think this is a serious question for the council to take. So what can we do to convince your fellow counselors to listen, either individually or in a process, a committee meeting or whatever? And you go at it that way. If it's possible to get some interest in the press, then the citizens of that jurisdiction will be interested, some of them. And as the councilors find out that their constituents are interested in this question, they'll become interested in the question. And so you grind away at it as much as you can.
An idea that I would come with, since I've been involved in other county council kind of things over the years, is I would talk about how much money this is costing them. What was Calgary spending to buy this poison to put into the water?
Well, at the time, in 2011, at the time that they voted to stop fluoridating the water, they were spending $750,000 a year on operating the system. That means
$750,000.
$750,000. Okay,
$750,000.
Yeah, but that's what was for a city of about 1 million. We're about at 1.3 million now, and our water system serves some smaller communities nearby. So they were spending $750,000 a year to operate it, but because of the corrosive nature of the solution that gets the hydrofluorosilicic acid in, it's very damaging to the system that puts it in the water. So it has to be maintained, and every several years, I don't know how many, maybe every 5 years or something like that, it has to be replaced. And Calgary at the time, as I say, when it stopped fluoridation, they were facing the necessity to replace some of the equipment, if not all of it. And the estimates from within the technical staff of the city varied from $1 to $6 million of what it would cost to bring the system up to usable state. And so that if that had to happen every 5 years, so you're spending another $1 million, on maintenance of the system, in addition to the $750,000 you're spending on the operation of it. So that's a big expense. And when the council stopped it, they part of their motion to start the process of stopping it included the provision of money to help underprivileged, low socioeconomic status people in the city to get advice and dental care. Now, there, by the way, are very much cheaper and much more effective ways of preventing cavities, and they have to do with dental education, and they have to do with diet, and they have to do with brushing your teeth and so on. And these systems have been put in place in places in Denmark and I think the Netherlands on a large scale, and they're very effective in preventing cavities, and they don't need fluoride to do that. So
I would think that would be the easiest sell to the county council. Stop spending this money. It's ridiculous. Yeah. That would be the angle that I'd attack them for. Everybody understands dollars and cents. But they must be getting paid somewhere along the line. You've got to be quite a salesman to come out and sell this stuff to a county council to put in the water to start with.
Well, there's money against us here. And I have some pretty nasty stories about that, which I won't go on to necessarily. But they're companies that profit from cities fluoridating, or profit from the consequences of cities fluoridating, and they support the dental associations in Canada, the United States, and so on, with large sums of money to tell people that fluoridation is wonderful and that people against the fluoridation are crazy. And that's one of the things we're up against. And there, in fact, well, you probably know the story of the Tobacco Research Institute, which is still alive, by the way. The profit-making interests create these things to make their position look legitimate and responsible. So you have to look, carefully with, and not be nasty and overtly accusative, but you have to be suspicious of everything where money's involved.
Absolutely. Question everything.
Yeah.
That's what we say. Folks, we have the pleasure of talking with Dr. James Beck this evening. He is co-author of The Case Against Fluoridation with Dr. Paul Connett. And Jim, let me ask you some other things. This has had to be kind of shocking to you that they weren't just going on the evidence.
What was your question again?
This had to be shocking to you when you first started talking to people and talked to the public health bureaucrats and find out that they were the hardest people to win over.
Well, yeah, it is shocking, and I can't get used to it. I haven't adjusted it. I don't accept that. I had a private, personal conversation with a medical officer of health once who insisted that fluoridation was not mass medication. Well, what is it? And I kept pushing him, and I finally got him to agree that it's mass administration.
That's the definition of ignorance. When they're choosing to ignore the science.
Well, he was pushed up against the wall, and he, instead of reacting honestly, he defended his position. And if he's known by his employers not to promote fluoridation, he'd probably lose his job. And another medical officer of health, one of the higher up ones in Alberta, once I discovered that they were in a hospital in Edmonton. They were discharging women after giving birth with a lot of promotional stuff. They would give you, and one of the promotions was for a company that produced what's called nursery water. It was fluoridated water,
Yeah.
And I told him, look, you got to stop that. The one of the most susceptible to negative effects of ingesting fluoride are infants. By the way, the evolution took care of that because for natural birth, because the concentration of fluoride in the amniotic fluid is very close to zero, even for women who are in fluoridated areas. So evolution's been working on that for millions of years. It must know something that these medical officers of health don't know. Anyway, this fellow, he did stop it, I hope in all hospitals. All I know is that he stopped it in the one in particular that I complained about. But in the conversation we had with exchanging through emails, he said, there's no evidence that fluoride is related with any adverse effect. But even promoters of fluoridation generally admit that it causes dental fluorosis. And by the way, over 30% of the children, as I said, in the United States have dental fluorosis. So
just the thyroid question alone. When I realized that I had a thyroid issue, and it was caused mostly by mercury, but I'm sure the fluoride in the water before I knew not to drink, city water was there. I grew up on city water, but I had a difficult time finding toothpaste that didn't have fluoride in it. And when you read the warning label on the toothpaste tube, it says if you swallow even a pea size, toothpaste, you need to call the hazmat team.
Well, they use in toothpaste. They use concentrations of 1.5 to 4,000 parts per million. And for fluoridated water, the general goal now is 0.7 parts per million. But you can use fluoridated toothpaste to good advantage if you use it carefully. Like you don't keep it in your mouth very long and you rinse your mouth thoroughly. And with children, it's very dangerous because you shouldn't even try that until they're old enough to understand
if you get children to brush their teeth with magnesium oil, it tastes very salty. It's not really an oil. Dentists can't even drill into their teeth. It makes their teeth so hard. I mean, why don't you teach your children to do that instead of giving them a poison?
Well, yeah. Anyway, the Dental Association in the United States and in Canada have varied over the past years. While people like me bombard them with questions on how to come to their recommendations, until fairly recently, they said don't give any fluoridated water or use fluoridated toothpaste or fruits and vegetables that are subjected to chemicals to protect them from insects and so on with fluoride. Don't have them do anything with fluoride. And then now, I think in both their websites, they have a schedule at certain ages when how much should be allowed. But they're not really talking about how much. Most of them seem to think they are, but they're talking about the concentration of the water, which doesn't determine how much they're exposed to.
You don't know what one person's going to drink and and then the juice issue. Pardon me. There's an issue with not only just the water that comes out of the tap, but the products that we buy that are fluoridated because they were mixed with water that had fluoride in it, and you don't even know that.
Yeah. There's I think the latest thing I've seen in the magazines and newspapers is about various things that are in all the water and you can't escape it, and it includes medications and so on because the water in many places is reprocessed, from wastewater, and the reprocessing doesn't get rid of, it might get rid of the bacteria and so on, but it doesn't get rid of all those molecules.
No, it doesn't get rid of all the hormone molecules from birth control pills and things like that. Exactly. Yeah. There was some good news today from Australia.
Some
good news from Australia that there are councils there that are taking the bull by the horns and refusing to allow the public health to push their dinosaur toxic waste policy, just like Calgary. So apparently folks in Australia are waking up.
Australia is particularly bad with fluoridation because uh, until a few years ago, the resistance to it was not getting anywhere, and it was so bad that in one case, one of the major states of Australia got a new governor. Under the process at that time, she wasn't elected. She was appointed and made governor, and immediately mandated that all of the water systems for potable water in her state had to be fluoridated. That law has been rescinded now. But Australia and New Zealand are particularly bad about it, and the scientists and the dentists who are promoting fluoridation have been particularly bad there in terms of misrepresenting the information that's available. So it's a tough one.
Wow. I mean, I wonder, I'd like to see her campaign finances revealed. Who was donating to her campaign to get her to do that? Yeah. Apparently, Queensland, my producer here says, is only 5% fluoridated, but the rest of Australia is very bad.
Yeah.
Gosh.
In New Zealand, there's an effort to make it nationwide fluoridation, and they had recently appointed a committee of experts to review the question of fluoridation, but actually they were recruited to defend it, whether they should or not, and they misrepresented it horribly. Like there's this very strong study of the relationship of fluoride, ingestion of fluoride, and intelligence quotient in a 2010 paper, where 27 communities were examined, and they compared to pairs of communities. They were 27 studies, and they would take similar villages, usually, like in Canada and in China, say, because the populations were all very much the same, and all the families had lived there for generations, and so on. But one of them had well water that had a lot of fluoride, and the other one had almost no fluoride. And they compared the effects of two. One of the comparisons was with intelligence testing. 26 of those 27 showed a lower IQ in the high fluoridated compared to the low fluoridated water villages. And that's a rare degree of consistency in biologic.
I'd say that's pretty damning.
Yeah. So but in New Zealand they refused to say that the overall result, it was a meta-analysis which puts all this data together, in a systematic way, and the result was given in the paper as it should have been, in terms of a fraction of what's called the standard error of the procedure. It was minus 0.45. That was a reduction in intelligence overall, intelligence quota.
Well, I've always read, maybe I'm just a conspiracy theorist here, doctor, but I've always read that fluoride, because of its neurochemical properties, actually causes passive people to be more passive and violent people to be more violent. Has there been any studies on that?
No, I know of no evidence of that sort.
Okay.
But this study, this meta-analysis, I just want to finish the point. The point is that in New Zealand, this group of experts at first said that the loss of intelligence was it changed by minus 0.45. Well, in terms of IQ points, that's nothing. But what really happened is that at minus 0.45 of standard error corresponds to 6.9 IQ points. Now, in a large population, that would move that bell-shaped curve to the left, and it would mean that you've more than doubled the number of people whom the psychologists would call retarded, who need medical and social assistance. And at the other end of the bell curve, you would have reduced by more than a half the number of the people they would call geniuses. And that was a terribly misleading and deliberate. And the similar thing happened here. I was in a public meeting, which was also before the entire council in a fairly sizable city here in Alberta, and the medical officer of health, and we're talking about that study, said that was minus 0.45 IQ points, and he was corrected. There was a pause, and he was corrected. And it was explained to him. And then when the new session, he said to my colleague who was with me there, he said, well, my colleague told him you should correct that. And he said, well, I'll consider it. But he didn't.
Wow. Well, so, listen, we're out of time. And I know the music's going to start in a minute. And it's starting now. And so I've left off a couple of big questions, and maybe we'll be able to have you back another time. Dr. James Beck, thank you so much. It's been enlightening here this evening. Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.